Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here tonight. So I'm going to just start off telling you a little bit more about Rett syndrome before going on to talk about the really global efforts to develop treatments and cures for this disorder. So you can have the first slide. So we've heard a description of Rett syndrome. Rett syndrome is the most devastating disorder because for the most part, these girls are born healthy, bouncing babies. They meet all the early developmental milestones, and it's typically a little later on that we notice things start going awry. And in fact, things get even worse. So after a sort of period of stagnation, you get what's called regression. So these girls who might have learned to walk, some language skills, they typically lose these, or very often lose these. And there's also a range of other, very problematic features of the disorder, as you've heard. So the girls have very often bad seizures, breathing abnormalities, difficulty in feeding, and so on. And later on, one sees movement effects. So at the outset, you can see there's a sort of trajectory here of increasing severity of symptoms. And these are lifelong symptoms. And at the moment, as you've heard, there's no cure for Rett syndrome, but there are great efforts in that direction. So next slide. So what causes Rett syndrome? So Rett syndrome is a genetic disorder. So in the diagram here on the right, these are the chromosomes, the sex chromosomes. So all the men here in the audience, they have one of each of these. The one on the left is the X chromosome, and the one on the right is the Y chromosome. And girls have two X chromosomes. Now, Rett syndrome is a disease in which the bottom part of this X chromosome, things go awry. So it turns out, in fact, that the X chromosome is a very sensitive area of the genome. So there are lots of things that go wrong spontaneously with this part of the chromosome, and it actually causes quite a range of disorders. But Rett syndrome is the most severe. And you don't hear much about boys with Rett syndrome, and the reason for that is the boys, it's much more severe in boys because they only have one X chromosome. So if something goes wrong with it, unfortunately, it's normally fatal. So they typically don't survive infancy. But the girls, females are genetically stronger, if you like. They have two X chromosomes, so they have a backup copy. So the features are milder in girls, although it's obviously very severe. The gene was identified in 1999. It's called MECP2. So this is the gene that is mutated in Rett syndrome. And the gene is important for lots of different things, but it has a very important role in the brain and the nervous system. Okay, so next slide. So a number of years ago, we asked the question, is this disorder, is this Rett syndrome a treatable disorder? Because at the time, a lot of these so-called neurodevelopmental disorders, they were thought to be essentially untreatable disorders. Something goes awry with the brain, the circuitry, and there's nothing you can do about that. But in fact, this appears not to be the case. So you can take the gene, MECP2 is a conserved gene, it's same across all species, and you can actually switch it off. And if you switch this gene off in mice, you get a remarkable set of features which are almost identical to those that you see in Rett girls. So they're normal initially, so there are no features, but then they begin to develop all the features you see in Rett syndrome. So abnormal hand movements, seizures, abnormal breathing, abnormal movement. So it models the disorder very accurately when you switch off this gene. Remarkably, when you switch off the gene, remarkably, if you switch the gene back on in these mice, these features go away. The seizures go away. They begin to move normally, their breathing returns to normal. So essentially, this is a reversible disorder. There is potential to treat this disorder if we're smart enough. And that's really where the efforts are coming into ways to actually rectify this disorder. So next slide. So this is the sort of loop for drug discovery. Rett syndrome was described quite recently. It was only in the 1960s that there was a definitive diagnosis for Rett syndrome, and the gene wasn't discovered until 1999. But we now know about the disorder. We've organizations is really studying the neurobiology. What does this gene actually do? And as we know more about what the gene does, where are there opportunities to intervene to develop therapies and then to test those therapies in trials. So the Reverse Rett has funded a number of projects globally, and one of the things that they're really good at is getting scientists to work together. So normally science is quite a competitive business, and people don't really share ideas. But what Reverse Rett has done is actually put people together into consortia to really work in a synchronous manner to tackle these big questions. So for instance, the Rett Syndrome Research Consortium was set up earlier this year, and the idea of this consortium is to develop what's called a gene therapy approach to Rett syndrome. So Rett syndrome is actually quite a simple disorder. It's one gene that is dysfunctional. So an obvious therapy is to actually deliver that gene, a therapeutic gene, if you like. And this has been developed for a number of disorders. So you can see in the consortium here, there are individuals who are already working in other disorders and already, in fact, have gene therapy projects in clinical trial for other disorders. And we're trying to now develop a gene therapy trial for Rett syndrome. And the initial experiments on the right here, you can see, again, this is a model of Rett syndrome, but the untreated graph on the right, you can see these symptoms progressing, so getting progressively worse. But with the gene therapy treatment, you can see that the symptoms following treatment are beginning to become much milder. So there's sort of preliminary encouraging evidence that this may be an effective avenue. So in fact, there are lots of researchers working across the world for therapies for Rett syndrome, and there's a variety of strategies. So one is to look at drug treatments, so take existing drugs and repurpose those drugs to see if there are existing medicines that may treat some of the features of Rett syndrome. And there are also studies looking at new drugs as well, developing new drugs specifically targeting Rett syndrome. And then there's a range of genetic experiments, so gene therapy is one. There are other very elegant experiments. So the girls, because they have this backup copy of the gene, the MECP2, some of the genes are actually switched off. They're in what's called the inactive X chromosome, which is switched off. So one of the therapies is to actually try and switch back on this gene to unlock this extra copy of MECP2. And then I guess the ultimate challenge is to actually go in and fix the mutations. And there's been massive progress just this year alone in developing technologies which allow you to go in and, rather than replacing the whole gene, fix the mutation within the cell. So I'd like to just end talking about Reverse Rett. So this last graph here is a graph of publications on Rett syndrome. So this is basically a marker of how much activity there is in the field. So you'll see, so this spans 40 years. So you can see that 1960s, 1970s, up until the mid-1980s, there were only a really small handful of studies on Rett syndrome. But there was a resurgence of interest in the 1980s. And when the gene was identified in 1999, this is ramping up again. And when the disorder was shown to be fundamentally reversible in 2007, you can see suddenly there's a big acceleration in studies. And what's important is most of these studies to the right here, the current studies, are not looking at the sort of genetics and clinical diagnosis of the disease, but they're looking for therapies, trying to target the disorder and develop therapies and hopefully ultimately a cure for the disorder. And the Rett Syndrome Research Trust have really been a terrific player in this. You know, in such a short time, they've made huge efforts. They're really funding the best science, so they're funding top labs. They're getting people that don't work on Rett syndrome but are big in a particular field to become interested in Rett syndrome and work on Rett syndrome and dedicate their work towards finding cures. They form these very effective networks, which has been, which allows this efficient and really focused targeting of the disorder. So I'd just like to finish off thanking the Reverse Rett. It's a terrific job. And finally, what I should mention is that virtually all of this research is funded by organizations such as Reverse Rett. So this is not drug companies that are funding this research. Rett syndrome is a rare disorder, and this research is not funded through the pharmaceutical or biotechnology companies, and very little, in fact, is funded by government. It's mainly funded by organizations such as Reverse Rett. So thank you for your time. Thank you very much.